Hello, welcome once again to Leto's Law. I'm Steve Leto. Still getting over the cold or whatever it was that I had or still have. I'm sure you can hear it in my voice. I can hear it. And I've got a little bit of a sore throat thing going, and my head's a little foggy, so I'll do my best. But the show must go on. And several people sent me a great story out of Louisiana. And you recall that Louisiana is the state where the Supreme Court said that when a man said he wanted a lawyer, dog, that he must have been actually asking for a canine lawyer. That is, a dog who practiced law. And we were pointing out that this is kind of a silly result, but that's the result they wanted and they got it. So, more news out of Louisiana. This time, a lower court has ruled that New Orleans must refund more than $25 million in red light camera tickets. So, I've railed about red light cameras and all those different things that they can do to give you a ticket through automation. And the city of New Orleans may be on the hook to pay more than $25 million to motorists who received red light camera tickets between 2008 and 2010 after an appeals court has ruled against the city. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal this week upheld an earlier judgment against New Orleans that tickets issued to more than 200,000 drivers are invalid. And here's the thing, it's a technicality. They were handled by the Department of Public Works and not the police department. So, generally speaking, as you might think, tickets are written by cops, police officers, law enforcement. Tickets are law enforcement. And so apparently, New Orleans had the Department of Public Works, which is the people who plow the streets in Michigan or sweep the streets everywhere else, writing tickets. And you can't have, the people who handle the sewers writing tickets if they aren't the same people who do law enforcement. So, Judge Robert Burns ruled against the city in 2017 as several similar lawsuits that were consolidated into a class action were brought before him. The city quickly appealed, arguing that it was within its rights to assign tickets to a city hall agency rather than the New Orleans Police Department. But a three-judge panel of the Fourth Circuit issued a ruling Wednesday that city's home rule charter states, and this is a quote, a traffic bureau within the New Orleans Police Department shall be responsible for enforcing the street regulations of the city. So the law is the law. If you didn't like the law, you shouldn't have written it that way. The $25 million judgment plus interest will now be added to a long list of unpaid judgments against the city because the city can't be subject to forfeiture for non-payment. It has left millions of dollars in judgments unpaid for decades. And that's another problem. You win the lawsuit, but can you collect? Most of the unpaid lawsuits are owed to individuals, not large classes of plaintiffs. In the red light camera cases, Judge Burns ruled that the city shall immediately refund the fines and fees to plaintiffs. Most of the individual fines that were improperly collected were $110 for running a red light. The city is likely to appeal. Spokesperson LaTanya Norton said that they are going to file an appeal, and the appeal could be made in the form of a reconsideration request to the Fourth Circuit or directly to the state Supreme Court, the people who brought us the lawyer dogs. I would suggest that the only appropriate thing here to do is to recuse the entire panel of the Louisiana Supreme Court and have it replaced with lawyer dogs. And have the lawyer dogs issue an opinion. And if you can get 4 out of 7 to agree on anything, that's the side that wins. That's just me, but I doubt they'll do that. Now, if you said, Steve, what do you think is going to happen here? Because people often ask me to predict the future. If I had to guess, what I suspect is going to happen is it would go up to the Louisiana Supreme Court on appeal. And the same way that they came to the conclusion that a man who was in his right mind was asking for a dog that practiced law to be brought to his aid, they're going to say, oh, the city Department of Public Works issued tickets, but it's part of the city. And even though the law says that they can't do that, they can. The same way you can ask for a lawyer dog. Why not? So we already know that the Louisiana Supreme Court doesn't really care about how it looks. They're going to just go, what do we need to have as a ruling? What ruling do we want? And how do we get there? And it's a backwards way of thinking, but I wouldn't have been so crass about it before I read the case about the lawyer dog. And now I'm like, oh, they can get any conclusion they want. And so if they're asked Do you want to force the city to face a $25 million judgment, or do you want to just come up with some contorted thinking that would protect you? Which would you do? And I suspect they'll come up with a contorted thinking. So, again, the funny thing about this, of course, is that this has nothing to do with how righteous these cameras are. I've had people tell me, they say, Steve, if you don't run a red light, you don't have to worry about a red light camera. But we pointed out that, number one, they shorten the time on the yellows to catch more people. They often, occasionally, will claim you ran a red light when you made a right turn on red legally. And there are ways that these things can malfunction. And, of course, since there's no human being there watching what's happening, they have to compare a photograph with your testimony to determine who's telling the truth. And it's just a weird situation. So I've always thought that as a matter of the constitutional right to face your accusers, that your accusers actually, at the most basic level, ought to be human. Now, I'm not saying that photographs, cameras, and things of that nature shouldn't be used in court. They should be. They should absolutely be allowed in court. And I've talked before about the standard for letting a photograph get into evidence, for instance. And you don't need to bring in the photographer, for example. So it's not uncommon. And I've had cases by myself where I had a witness on the stand and I said, I'm going to show you a photograph. And do you recognize the photograph? And they say, well, yeah, it's a photograph of my car. How do you know? I recognize the car, and they go through the whole process. I never even ask them who took the photograph. They didn't take it themselves. Who cares? As long as they can recognize the subject matter of the photograph and you can lay a foundation, a photograph can get in through a witness. The problem with a red light camera is that it was taken by a machine. And yes, you can bring in someone from the city who can say, we set these machines up, they take these photographs, and they can explain the whole process of how the machines work. But when they say, and the machine took this photograph, and it shows something that I didn't see happen, no one saw it happen except for the person who's the defendant and this machine, and there's a bunch of assumptions or presumptions that go into believing that what's shown in the camera photograph is something that someone else can testify to. And it just seems to me there's a slight disconnect there. It's not huge. It's not the end of the world, but it's always bothered me. And I understand that in most jurisdictions, for a ticket like that to stick, someone's got to actually sign a complaint or sign something and say, yes, I reviewed this. But reviewing it's not the same as seeing it happen. So if I handed the photograph to the witness and said, what's this photograph of? And they said, oh, it's of, the Johnson residence. If I said, how do you know that? And they said, oh, someone told me it was. Well, that's not going to work for foundation to get a photograph into evidence. And so I have a major foundational problem, if not the larger constitutional issue of facing your accuser, because the question is, and I don't mean to get all Star Trek on you here, but who's the accuser here? Someone who designs a programmed camera to take photographs, and it takes photographs. Who's the accuser? So that's the situation with the New Orleans courts, and that's my phone going off into the room. I apologize, but again, foggy-headed. Didn't occur to me to shut the darn thing off. So questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.